Dad, I will call you tomorrow, Daniel Carter said as he tapped the red button before the call could last more than a few seconds, believing those 5 simple words were harmless because tomorrow always felt guaranteed. On the other end of the line, Michael Carter slowly lowered his phone without disappointment on his face, only the quiet acceptance that comes from hearing the same promise too many times. The little house had never sounded so empty. The ticking clock on the living room wall echoed through the hallway, while the late afternoon sunlight stretched across the hardwood floor toward the old recliner beside the front window. That chair had become Michael's favorite place during the past several years, because from there he could see every car that turned onto the street. Every afternoon around 5 o'clock, he found himself glancing outside, wondering if perhaps today would be different. Perhaps today his son would surprise him with a visit. Perhaps today the driveway would finally welcome familiar footsteps again. But today, like so many days before it, the driveway remained empty. Michael gently placed the phone on the small table beside his chair. He looked toward the family photograph resting in a worn wooden frame. It showed a younger Daniel with a missing front tooth, proudly holding a baseball glove almost bigger than his arm, while Michael stood behind him with one hand resting on his son's shoulder. Michael smiled softly at the memory. There had been a time when Daniel asked him hundreds of questions every day. A time when one afternoon together felt too short. A time when his son would race through the front door shouting, "Dad, you have to come see this." Somewhere between childhood and adulthood, those afternoons quietly disappeared, replaced by calendars, meetings, business trips, deadlines, and promises of next week. Michael never blamed his son for building a successful life. In fact, he had spent decades encouraging him to chase every opportunity. He simply had not expected success to place so many miles between two people living less than 30 miles apart. The kitchen still carried the comforting smell of homemade chicken soup, simmering on the stove. Michael had prepared enough for 2 people, just as he always did whenever Daniel mentioned there was even a small chance he might stop by after work. 2 bowls waited neatly on the dining table beside folded napkins and polished silverware. The second chair remained perfectly pushed in, untouched, almost hopeful. Michael glanced at the clock again before picking up his phone one more time. His thumb hovered over Daniel's name. He hesitated. He did not want to interrupt another meeting. He did not want to become another obligation squeezed between conference calls. Instead, he opened the voice message screen. For several seconds he said nothing. Then, in the calm voice that had comforted his son through childhood fevers, broken bicycles, and difficult school days, he quietly recorded, "Hi Daniel. I just wanted to hear your voice today. The soup is almost ready. I made your favorite just in case you found a little time this evening. If not, that is all right. Whenever you have time, son. I will be here." He listened to the message once before sending it. Across town, Daniel's phone vibrated on the conference room table, while executives discussed quarterly forecasts projected across a large screen. He glanced down, saw his father's name, and gently turned the phone face down without opening the notification. "I will listen later," he whispered almost absent-mindedly, already returning his attention to charts and schedules that demanded immediate decisions. Outside Michael's window, the evening breeze rustled the maple tree his late wife had planted decades earlier. Inside the quiet house, the second bowl of soup slowly cooled while one unanswered message joined countless others waiting patiently, never asking for much, only hoping that tomorrow would finally become today. The next morning arrived with the same quiet rhythm that had slowly become Michael Carter's closest companion. Long before sunrise painted the neighborhood in soft shades of gold, he was already awake, carefully folding the blanket on his bed before making his way toward the kitchen. He moved more slowly than he had a few years earlier, but every movement carried purpose. The coffee maker hummed softly while slices of bread warmed in the toaster. Across the small kitchen table sat only one plate, yet Michael automatically reached into the cabinet for a second mug before catching himself halfway through the motion. He smiled gently and placed it back on the shelf. Some habits were built from love, and they refused to disappear simply because life had changed. After breakfast, he picked up the newspaper from the front porch, settled into the familiar chair beside the window, and glanced toward the driveway almost without thinking. It was a routine so deeply woven into his days that he barely noticed himself doing it anymore. Every passing pickup truck, every family sedan, Every delivery van briefly captured his attention before continuing down the quiet street. By mid-morning, the house returned to complete silence except for the steady ticking of the old clock that had hung in the living room since Daniel was in middle school. Michael stood and walked toward the hallway where family photographs lined the wall in simple wooden frames. There was one from Daniel's high school graduation, another from college, one from his wedding, and another holding his first newborn daughter. Michael gently dusted each frame with the corner of a soft cloth. He never spoke aloud while doing it, yet every photograph carried a conversation inside his heart. He felt proud every single time he looked at them. Pride had never been the problem. The loneliness had quietly grown beside it. Across town, Daniel's day unfolded at a completely different pace. His calendar was filled from early morning until evening with presentations, client meetings, conference calls, budget reviews, and constant notifications that seemed to arrive faster than he could answer them. His assistant reminded him that another business trip would begin the following Monday. His wife texted asking whether he would be home in time for dinner with the children. His smartwatch vibrated every few minutes with another deadline waiting to be solved. Somewhere beneath those reminders rested the unopened voice message from his father. Daniel noticed it several times throughout the morning. Each time he thought the same sentence. "I will listen after this meeting." The promise sounded reasonable every time he repeated it. At noon, Michael opened the refrigerator and saw the container of chicken soup from the night before. He carefully warmed another bowl, sat alone at the dining table, and looked at the empty chair across from him. He remembered the years when Daniel rushed home from baseball practice, dropping his equipment by the front door before asking what was for dinner. Back then, conversation had filled every corner of the house. They talked about school, friends, dreams, and sometimes nothing important at all. Michael found himself smiling at the memory instead of mourning it. He never wanted his son to feel guilty for growing up. He simply wished adulthood had left a little more room for ordinary afternoons together. Later that afternoon, Michael walked into the spare bedroom that had remained almost untouched since Daniel moved away. The bed was neatly made. Old trophies still rested on the bookshelf beside faded comic books, and a model airplane they had built together one rainy weekend many years ago. Michael carefully straightened the blanket even though it was already perfectly smooth. He looked around the room with quiet affection before whispering to himself, "It still feels like you just stepped outside for a little while." Back at his office, Daniel finally had a brief break between meetings. He unlocked his phone, saw his father's unread message once again, and reached for his earbuds. Before he could press play, another urgent call interrupted the moment. He answered immediately, stood from his chair, and hurried down the hallway toward another conference room, leaving the message unopened for one more day without realizing that some moments ask for only a minute but can never be reclaimed once they quietly slip away. Days quietly blended into one another until Daniel Carter no longer noticed how often he postponed the people he loved in favor of the responsibilities that always seemed more urgent. Every morning began with alarms, calendars, traffic reports, and conference calls. Every evening ended with unfinished emails and promises that tomorrow would be different. Somewhere between those busy hours, his father's name continued appearing on his phone with remarkable consistency. Sometimes it was a missed call placed just after breakfast. Sometimes it was a short text asking how the grandchildren were doing. Sometimes it was nothing more than a cheerful photograph of the maple tree outside the old house changing with the season. Daniel rarely ignored them on purpose. He simply believed there would always be another opportunity to respond. Whenever guilt briefly surfaced, he comforted himself with the same familiar thought. Dad understands. He always has. That belief became so comfortable that it slowly replaced action. One Friday afternoon, Michael stood in the grocery store holding a small shopping basket containing only a loaf of bread, fresh vegetables, and Daniel's favorite apple pie. The cashier smiled kindly and asked, "Having family over this weekend?" Michael returned the smile with quiet optimism. "Maybe," he answered. "My son has been very busy, but sometimes weekends surprise you." The cashier wished him luck without realizing how much hope had been packed into that single word. Back at the house, Michael carefully prepared the guest's bedroom even though no one had mentioned staying overnight. Fresh towels were folded neatly at the foot of the bed. Clean sheets stretched smoothly across the mattress. He even placed a favorite childhood blanket inside the closet, smiling at the thought that his grandchildren might enjoy hearing stories in the room where their father once slept. Everything felt ready except the sound of another voice inside the house. Late that afternoon, Michael picked up the phone again but paused before pressing the call button. He looked at the family calendar hanging beside the refrigerator. Several dates had been circled in blue ink over the past few months. Each circle marked a visit Daniel had hoped to make. Beside every date, Michael had quietly written one word after the plans changed. Rescheduled. He never crossed them out in anger. He simply moved his hope forward one more week. Across the city, Daniel finally left the office earlier than usual. As he climbed into his car, he noticed the weather was beautiful. For a brief moment, he considered driving to his father's house instead of going straight home. It had been several weeks since they sat together without rushing anywhere. He even reached for his phone to call ahead. Before dialing, another notification appeared announcing that an important client had unexpectedly arrived from out of state and wanted dinner that evening to discuss a new partnership. Daniel closed his eyes for a second before sending his father a quick message instead. "Sorry, Dad. Something came up again. Next weekend for sure." He pressed send and placed the phone on the passenger seat, believing the message was enough. A few minutes later, Michael heard the familiar notification sound. He read the text slowly, smiled with gentle understanding, and typed only 4 words in return. "Of course, take care." He did not mention the fresh pie cooling on the kitchen counter. He did not mention the clean guest room or the extra groceries waiting in the refrigerator. He simply carried the pie into the dining room and placed it beside 2 empty plates that remained set out a little longer than necessary. Outside, the evening sun settled behind the maple tree while long shadows stretched across the quiet yard. Inside the old house, Michael sat beside the window once again, watching every pair of headlights that passed without slowing down. Somewhere across town, Daniel enjoyed a successful business dinner surrounded by conversation and celebration, never realizing that the shortest message he received that evening had carried the deepest disappointment, because some hearts become experts at hiding their loneliness from the people they love most. Autumn arrived almost unnoticed, painting the maple tree outside Michael Carter's living room window in shades of gold and deep red. Yet inside the little house the days continued with the same quiet rhythm. Every morning he opened the curtains just after sunrise, watered the flowers his late wife had once cared for, and placed a fresh pot of coffee on the kitchen counter even though he rarely finished more than 1 cup. The second mug still found its way onto the table almost every weekend before he gently smiled at himself and returned it to the cabinet. Some hopes faded slowly, refusing to disappear all at once. The neighbors had begun noticing small changes that Michael himself never mentioned. Mrs. Evelyn Parker, who lived across the street, no longer saw him walking around the neighborhood every evening as he had for years. Instead, he spent more time sitting beside the front window with a blanket folded neatly across his knees, quietly watching children ride bicycles past the house. One afternoon she carried over a loaf of homemade banana bread and knocked softly on the front door. Michael welcomed her with the same warm smile he offered everyone. They talked about the changing weather, the flowers in the yard, and the upcoming holidays. Before leaving, Evelyn hesitated for a moment and gently asked, "Has Daniel been by lately?" Michael looked toward the family photographs on the wall before answering with complete sincerity. "He has been working very hard. He has a wonderful family to take care of. I am proud of him. He never said he missed his son. He never complained. His love always seemed larger than his loneliness." Later that evening, Evelyn stood on her own porch thinking about the conversation. Something in Michael's smile had felt different. It was still kind but quieter somehow, as though he had learned not to expect too much from tomorrow. She picked up her phone and searched for Daniel's number, which she still had from years earlier when he helped repair her fence after a storm. Across town, Daniel had just finished another long day at the office when his phone rang. Seeing Evelyn's name surprised him. He answered immediately. "Mrs. Parker, is everything all right?" Her voice remained gentle. "Daniel, I hope I am not interrupting, but I wanted to check whether you have seen your father recently." Daniel leaned back in his chair. "Not for a few weeks. Things have been incredibly busy." "Why do you ask?" Evelyn paused before speaking again. "He seems more tired than usual." He still smiles, but he spends most afternoons sitting by the window. I just thought, perhaps he would enjoy seeing you. Daniel felt a brief sting of guilt, but habit quickly softened it. Thank you for telling me. I was already planning to visit next weekend. Evelyn quietly replied. I hope next weekend comes soon enough. After the call ended, Daniel remained still for several moments. He opened the family calendar on his phone and searched for an opening. Every day appeared crowded with appointments, presentations, and travel. He finally selected the following Saturday and created a reminder that read, Visit Dad. Seeing the reminder gave him an unexpected sense of relief, as though scheduling love somehow guaranteed it would happen. At the same moment, Michael carefully folded another clean blanket in the spare bedroom and straightened the old baseball glove resting on a shelf beside Daniel's childhood trophies. He glanced at the calendar hanging in his own kitchen where another Saturday had been circled in blue ink. He smiled softly and whispered into the quiet room, maybe this time. Outside, the wind carried a handful of colorful leaves across the front yard before settling them gently against the porch steps, while inside the old house 2 calendars, separated by less than 30 miles, quietly counted down toward the same weekend for very different reasons. Saturday arrived with clear blue skies and cool autumn air. Exactly the kind of morning Michael Carter had always loved. He woke before sunrise with more energy than he had felt in weeks, humming quietly while making coffee and opening the kitchen window just enough to let the crisp breeze drift through the house. Today the silence somehow felt hopeful instead of lonely. He glanced at the blue circle on the calendar hanging beside the refrigerator. This was the Saturday Daniel had promised to come. Michael did not allow himself to become overly excited. Life had taught him that plans could change. Even so, he found himself preparing the house with the quiet care of someone welcoming home a loved one after a long journey. He vacuumed the living room, polished the dining table, and carefully arranged fresh flowers from the garden in a small glass vase. In the kitchen, he prepared Daniel's favorite meal from childhood, slow-roasted pot roast with mashed potatoes, buttered green beans, and warm dinner rolls. He even baked an apple pie using the same handwritten recipe his late wife had tucked inside an old cookbook decades earlier. As the familiar aroma filled the house, memories seemed to settle gently into every room. Michael could almost hear the laughter that once echoed down the hallway when Daniel and his friends burst through the front door after baseball games, hungry enough to empty every serving dish on the table. He smiled at those memories, never realizing they had become more vivid than the present itself. By late morning everything was ready. The dining table was set for 4 instead of 2 because Michael hoped his grandchildren might come as well. Their favorite coloring books waited neatly in a basket beside the fireplace. A small bowl of wrapped chocolates sat in the center of the coffee table because his granddaughter always reached for one before asking permission. Every detail reflected a grandfather who never stopped preparing for visits that came far less often than he wished. Around noon Daniel left his house intending to keep his promise at last. His children had already climbed into the back seat when his phone rang through the car speakers. It was his regional director calling with unexpected news. A major client had discovered an error in an important contract that required immediate attention before the stock market opened overseas on Monday morning. Daniel gripped the steering wheel while listening. He looked at the road leading toward his father's neighborhood, and then at the navigation screen calculating the drive to his downtown office. The decision lasted only seconds, yet it carried the weight of another memory that had not yet been created. He sighed deeply and told the children, "We have to make one quick stop at work first." 1 hour became 2. 2 became 4. By the time the emergency meeting ended, the afternoon sun had already begun sinking toward the horizon. Daniel stared at the time on his dashboard and knew he should still drive to his father's house, but another thought quietly convinced him otherwise. It is getting late. Dad is probably resting. I will spend the whole day with him next weekend instead. He picked up his phone and typed another familiar message. I am so sorry, Dad. Something important came up. I promise I will make it up to you. He pressed send and rested his head against the seat for a moment, believing the apology would somehow replace the visit itself. At the old house, Michael heard the notification while checking the oven one last time. He wiped his hands on a kitchen towel before reading the message. For several seconds he simply stood there, looking at the screen without changing expression. Then he quietly placed the phone on the counter, walked to the dining table, and gently removed 3 of the 4 place settings. The food remained warm. The pie remained untouched. The only sound inside the house was the ticking clock and the soft rustle of leaves brushing against the front porch outside. Michael carried 1 plate to his chair beside the window, looked once more toward the empty driveway, and whispered with a tired but forgiving smile, "Maybe next Saturday, son." He truly believed those words because love has a remarkable way of protecting hope, even after disappointment has become a familiar guest. The following week passed with the same relentless pace that had come to define Daniel Carter's life, but something inside him felt slightly unsettled after missing another promised visit. He noticed it during quiet moments between meetings when his father's short message, "Of course, take care," unexpectedly drifted back into his thoughts. There had never been disappointment in Michael's words. There had never been anger. Somehow that made the silence even heavier. On Wednesday evening, Daniel finally remembered the unopened voice message his father had sent several days earlier. He reached for his phone while sitting alone in his office after everyone else had gone home. His thumb hovered over the play button. Before he could listen, another notification flashed across the screen announcing that his flight for next week's business conference had been rescheduled and required immediate confirmation. He sighed, handled the reservation, answered 2 more emails, and by the time he looked back at the message again, exhaustion had already convinced him to wait until morning. He slipped the phone into his pocket and walked out of the building, never realizing that another opportunity had quietly disappeared behind him. At the little house across town, Michael moved more slowly than usual. Even simple chores seemed to require longer pauses between each task. That afternoon he stood in Daniel's old bedroom, holding the model airplane they had built together when Daniel was 12 years old. One of its wings had come loose over the years. Michael carefully repaired it with a small amount of glue and placed it back on the shelf exactly where it had always been. He smiled softly as memories returned with remarkable clarity. He remembered Daniel insisting that the airplane would one day fly across the entire backyard. He remembered pretending to believe it even though they both laughed when it landed only a few feet away. Those small moments had never seemed extraordinary at the time. Looking back now, they had become life's greatest treasures. Later that evening, Michael opened the top drawer of the desk in his bedroom and removed a plain envelope along with a lined notebook. He sat beside the window where the last rays of sunlight stretched across the wooden floor and quietly began writing. He did not write because he expected the worst. He wrote because some feelings become easier to express on paper than over the telephone. The first sentence came slowly. "Dear Daniel, if you are reading this, it simply means I finally found the words I could never say without smiling first." Michael paused, looked out toward the empty driveway, and continued writing with steady hands. He described the pride he felt watching his son build a beautiful family. He wrote about baseball games, school graduations, fishing trips, and bedtime stories. He carefully avoided blaming anyone. Every sentence carried gratitude instead of regret. After several pages, he folded the letter neatly and placed it inside the envelope without sealing it. Beside it, he set a small flash drive containing old family photographs and several voice recordings he had quietly saved over the years. On top of everything, he placed one handwritten note that simply read, "For whenever you finally have a little time." The next morning, Evelyn Parker stopped by with fresh muffins and immediately sensed that Michael looked unusually tired. "You should let Daniel know you are not feeling well," she suggested gently. Michael smiled with his familiar kindness and shook his head. "He already carries enough responsibilities," he replied. "I would rather hear him laugh than hear him worry." Evelyn looked toward the envelope resting on the desk but said nothing. She understood that some parents spend their entire lives protecting their children from burdens, even when the greatest burden becomes carrying everything alone. As evening settled over the quiet neighborhood once again, the porch light came on automatically, casting a warm glow across the empty front steps while inside the little house an unsealed letter waited patiently on the desk, holding words that had spent years inside a father's heart, still hoping they might someday arrive before it became too late. 3 days later, Daniel Carter was halfway through another presentation when his phone vibrated twice in rapid succession. He ignored it at first, assuming it was another email demanding immediate attention. Only when the meeting ended did he glance down and notice 2 missed calls from Evelyn Parker followed by a short voicemail. Something about seeing her name instead of his father's made his stomach tighten. He stepped into the hallway, pressed play, and heard Evelyn's gentle but worried voice. "Daniel, please call me when you can. It is about your father." Those 8 words erased every other thought from his mind. He called her immediately. Evelyn answered after the first ring. "Daniel," she said softly, "your father has not been answering his phone since yesterday. I stopped by this morning. His car is still in the driveway, and the porch light was still on. I used the spare key he gave me years ago because I was worried." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "He is resting now, but he has been very weak. The doctor says he needs time, proper care, and someone close to him." Daniel leaned against the wall, closing his eyes. Relief that his father was receiving care mixed instantly with an overwhelming sense of guilt. "Why did he not call me?" he whispered. Evelyn answered with heartbreaking honesty. "Because he did not want to interrupt your life." Those words echoed through Daniel's mind long after the call ended. He canceled every remaining meeting that afternoon without explanation, climbed into his car, and drove toward the old neighborhood he had not visited in far too long. The familiar streets looked exactly as they always had. The bakery on the corner still displayed fresh pies in the front window. The small park where his father had taught him to ride a bicycle remained filled with children chasing one another across the grass. Everything appeared unchanged, yet Daniel felt as though he had been gone for years instead of weeks. When he finally pulled into the driveway, the little house stood quietly beneath the maple tree, whose leaves now covered the yard in shades of gold. He stepped onto the porch and hesitated before opening the front door with the spare key still hanging on his own keychain. The house greeted him with complete silence. Nothing looked neglected. Every room was clean, every picture perfectly straight, every blanket neatly folded. Yet the silence carried a weight he had never noticed before. It was the silence of conversations postponed too many times. Daniel slowly walked into the living room. Beside the window stood the familiar chair where his father had spent so many afternoons watching the street. A folded blanket rested across one arm. Reading glasses lay on the small table beside an unfinished crossword puzzle. Everything looked as though Michael had simply stepped into another room for a moment. Daniel instinctively reached for the glasses, then stopped himself. His eyes drifted toward the dining room where the table remained carefully arranged. Four matching chairs surrounded it. One placemat still sat perfectly centered, and in the middle rested a small glass vase holding flowers that had begun to dry at the edges. The sight stirred a memory so vivid that Daniel could almost smell fresh pot roast and warm dinner rolls. He suddenly remembered every invitation he had postponed, every Saturday he promised to visit, every message that ended with the words "next week." His chest tightened as he quietly walked down the hallway toward his old bedroom. The door stood slightly open. Inside, everything remained almost exactly as he had left it years earlier. The model airplane rested on the shelf. His baseball glove sat beside old trophies. The bed was perfectly made. Nothing in the room accused him, yet everything reminded him of a father who had carefully protected every piece of his childhood, while asking for almost nothing in return. Then Daniel noticed the bedroom desk. Resting neatly in the center was a plain envelope beside a small flash drive, waiting with the quiet patience that had defined his father's love for as long as he could remember. Daniel Carter stood motionless beside the old wooden desk, staring at the plain envelope as though it carried years he could never reclaim. His father's careful handwriting covered only a few words on the front. "For Daniel. Whenever you finally have a little time." The sentence felt almost impossible to breathe through because it echoed the same gentle words Michael had spoken at the end of nearly every phone call. Daniel slowly picked up the envelope, noticing that it had never been sealed. It was as though his father had left it open in case life gave them one more chance to speak face to face instead. With trembling hands, Daniel unfolded the neatly written pages inside. The first line immediately blurred behind unexpected tears. "Dear Daniel, if you are reading this, please do not begin by feeling guilty. I have lived a beautiful life because I had the privilege of being your father." Daniel stopped reading for a moment and closed his eyes. Every sentence carried kindness instead of accusation. Michael had not written about loneliness. He had not listed forgotten birthdays or canceled weekends. Instead, he wrote about the little boy who insisted on wearing his baseball cap to bed, the teenager who stayed up late building a science project at the kitchen table, and the young husband who proudly introduced his own children to their grandfather. Michael described those memories as though they had happened yesterday. Then the letter became quieter. There is only one thing I wished we had a little more of, and that was ordinary time together. Not holidays. Not special occasions. Just simple afternoons when we could talk about nothing important. Daniel felt another wave of emotion rise inside him. He remembered every invitation he had answered with next week, every meal replaced by another meeting, every phone call shortened because he believed there would always be another tomorrow. The next paragraph seemed almost impossible to read aloud. I know you never meant to stay away. Life asks a great deal from good people. I only hope that one day when your own children become busy building their lives, you will remember that parents rarely need perfect gifts. We simply hope for a little of your time while we are still here to enjoy it. Tears fell freely onto the paper. Daniel lowered the letter and noticed the small flash drive resting beside it. He carried it into the living room and inserted it into his laptop. A folder opened containing hundreds of photographs carefully organized by year. There were birthday parties, camping trips, fishing mornings, school concerts, Christmas mornings, and family barbecues. Each image reminded Daniel that his father had quietly preserved every season of his life, while asking for almost nothing in return. Another folder contained voice recordings. Daniel clicked the first file. Michael's familiar voice filled the silent room. Hi, buddy. I found your old baseball glove today. It still fits my hand better than I expected. Daniel smiled through tears. He opened another recording. Your daughter called me Grandpa Superhero today. I think that title is better than any award I could ever receive. Then he reached the final recording, the one he had never listened to when it first arrived on his phone. Michael's calm voice spoke exactly as it had that evening. Hi, Daniel. I just wanted to hear your voice today. The soup is almost ready. I made your favorite just in case you found a little time this evening. If not, that is all right. Whenever you have time, son. I will be here. The recording ended, but Daniel remained frozen in the quiet house. He looked toward the chair beside the window where his father had waited through so many evenings without complaint. For the first time, he truly understood that the greatest heartbreak inside the room was not the silence itself. It was realizing how many ordinary moments had quietly slipped away, while he believed they would always be waiting for him tomorrow. The sun rose gently over the old neighborhood several weeks later, casting warm light through the same living room window where Michael Carter had spent so many afternoons watching the quiet street with patient hope. The chair beside the window remained exactly where he had left it. The folded blanket still rested neatly across one arm, and the reading glasses remained on the small table beside the unfinished crossword puzzle. Daniel Carter stood in the doorway for a long moment before walking inside. This time there was no conference call waiting, no business dinner demanding his attention, no calendar reminding him to hurry somewhere else. For the first time in years, he had nowhere more important to be than exactly where he stood. Michael was recovering comfortably under professional care, and although his strength had not fully returned, the frightening days had changed something inside both father and son forever. Daniel had begun visiting every evening after work. Sometimes they talked for hours. Sometimes they simply sat together watching the sunset through the front window without saying very much at all. Surprisingly, those quiet evenings became the most meaningful conversations they had shared in years. One Saturday morning, Daniel arrived carrying breakfast instead of his laptop. His two children ran through the front door laughing as they searched for the old basket of coloring books beside the fireplace. Michael smiled with genuine happiness as he watched them fill the quiet house with life once again. The dining table that had waited through so many empty weekends was finally surrounded by family. Between pancakes, stories, and laughter, Daniel noticed something he had overlooked for years. His father was never asking for extraordinary moments. He had always treasured the ordinary ones. After breakfast, Daniel quietly walked into his childhood bedroom. Everything remained almost exactly as it had been, but now the room felt different. It no longer represented years that had disappeared. It represented years that could still teach him how to live. He carefully placed the letter back inside the desk drawer, not because he wanted to forget its words, but because he had already begun carrying them in his heart every single day. Before leaving the room, he looked at the old model airplane resting on the shelf and smiled. Later that afternoon, Daniel updated his calendar. The recurring Saturday business review that had occupied nearly every weekend for years quietly disappeared. In its place, he entered a new appointment that would repeat every week without exception. Family Day. No client could schedule over it. No meeting could replace it. No deadline would be allowed to steal it away again. The change did not stop with his own family. Daniel began volunteering at a local community center that organized weekly visits for older adults who rarely received company. He listened to stories that had waited years to be told. He watched grandchildren reconnect with grandparents after simple phone calls became regular visits. Every conversation reminded him that love rarely asks for perfection. It simply hopes not to be forgotten. One quiet evening, Daniel returned once more to the familiar chair beside the window while Michael rested peacefully in the next room. He looked out at the maple tree whose leaves had begun changing again with another season and softly whispered words he wished he had spoken much sooner. "I hear you now, Dad. I finally understand that the greatest gift you ever asked for was never money, success, or recognition. You only wanted time together." Outside, children rode bicycles past the house exactly as they had years before. Inside, the old clock continued its steady rhythm, but it no longer sounded like time slipping away. It sounded like another opportunity waiting to be appreciated. And if there was one lesson that remained long after every conversation ended, it was this. The people who love us most often ask for the smallest things. Yet those small moments become life's greatest treasures when we choose to give them before tomorrow quietly becomes too late.